And what we're doing today, sine qua non. Sine qua non is not a photography term. It's not a photography term like I told the people last week. It's a term that I learned from a doctor, and they use it in the medical field, sine qua non. What does sine qua non mean? Sine qua non is there you go, look at her. She's trying to get that shirt. She's trying to get that shirt. It's an essential condition, a thing that is absolutely necessary. And how I use it relating to photography and videography, I say understanding the fundamentals is the sine qua non of photography and videography. Because sine qua non is a condition or a thing that is absolutely necessary. And I believe that if you can understand the fundamentals, you can take your photography and videography to the next level. It's like you can take control of your camera. A lot of people buy a camera and they shoot with it and they get good at video sometime, or they take good pictures sometime, and they don't understand how they got it, and they can't repeat those same results. They can't repeat those results because they don't really understand the fundamentals of one of the most important things with photography and videography, which is the exposure triangle. And just to refresh, every component of the exposure triangle has two functions. They all have a technical function, and they all have the exact same technical function, which is that they control light in some kind of way, or they affect the light in some kind of way. That's the technical function for all three components of the exposure triangle, which is the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The technical function for all three is that they control light in some kind of way. The aesthetic function for each one of them is different, however. The aperture's aesthetic function is that it controls the depth of field, right? The shutter speed's aesthetic function is that it controls the motion blur. And let me know if I'm going too fast. I'll say it a couple times for everybody that's taking notes. And the ISO aesthetic function is that it controls the amount of noise or grain in the picture. So the depth of field, the aperture controls the depth of field. Again, the motion blur. The shutter speed controls the motion blur. The grain or noise in the image, the ISO, is what controls or affects that. Right. And while we're talking about the exposure triangle, just getting into it, let's refresh a little bit and talk about last week for those that wasn't here, and refresh for everybody else. For the aperture is an opening in the lens. It opens up to let in more light, and it closes down to cut down the amount of light that's coming in. That's the technical function. It opens up, lets in more light, it closes down to cut the amount of light that's coming in. The shutter speed, it deals with time. It's a time value. Matter of fact, on Canon cameras, if you see like the priority modes, you will see a TV. That TV stands for time value. That's the shutter priority mode. That's what it means, time value. So it's a time value, and it either opens and closes slower to let more light in, and it opens and closes faster to let less light in. And don't worry, I'm kind of going through them quick, but we're going to touch on them as we go through them, just refreshing about the technical part. And for everybody who was here last week, you know it's kind of hard to talk about one aspect without talking about the other, because last week you see I kept going into the aesthetics of it, because it's kind of hard to separate them because they work together, they intertwine. And then the ISO, it controls how much noise is in the image. And the noise is those little, when you take a picture and you see like those little green and purple dots on, especially like in the shadow areas, it's not really visible a lot in the highlight areas, but if you look in the shadows, you can start to see them. And that comes when you start having like a higher ISO, you see those little purple and green dots. That's noise, that's digital noise. And that comes from the ISO. It controls the sensitivity of the sensor, how sensitive the sensor is to how much light is out there. That's what the ISO controls the sensitivity, and that increases or decreases the noise. So that's the refresher. That's the refresher. Any questions before we move on? Any questions on the technical parts before we move on? Okay, we're moving into the aperture. We're gonna get right into it, the aperture. Okay. T-shirt time. T-shirt, first T-shirt giveaway. Who can remember, make sure it ain't up here so y'all don't cheat on me. Who can remember how each one of these are measured? They're measured in what? Close? You close? They measured in what? What about the light? Somebody can steal now. They measured in, no. They all measured in, there you go. There you go. Stops. I got one of each size from small to 2X. 1X. Congratulations. Stops of light. They all measured in stops of light. 1X. There you go, sir. Thank you. They all measure in stops of light. You was close. He jumped in and stole it on you. We still good. They all measure in stops of light. And a stop of light is no more than you're doubling your setting or cutting your setting in half. When you double your setting, you're increasing it by 1 stop of light. And that means, well, we'll get into it on the next slide. And when you cut your setting in half, you're decreasing it by 1 stop of light. And they're all measured in stops of light. And we're gonna really get into, how to play with them to get your exposure and all that a little bit later, but they all measured in stops of light.